You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Welcome to Campus Talks, the podcast in which we seek advice for those working in higher education from their colleagues around the world. I'm Miranda Prynne, campus editor, and today we are discussing research funding, or more specifically, doctoral funding, and how PhD students today can maximise their chances of securing financial backing amidst very tough competition. Even more specifically, we are zoning in on arts and humanities, since these are areas that the UK government appears to be deprioritising in terms of funding in favour of STEM disciplines that it's felt more closely align with economic and strategic priorities. The Arts and Humanities Research Council, AHRC, for instance, which is part of UKRI, that's UK Research and Innovation, is reducing the number of PhD studentships that it funds by almost a third, from 425 to 300 by 2029 to 30. However, the really heavy axe blow has fallen on student-initiated research projects, that is, PhDs whose topics are suggested by the students, and these are falling to just 150 awards next year, spread between 50 selected universities. So that's just 3 each, and many institutions, of course, are missing out completely. Now, this comes at a time when most UK universities are struggling to balance their own finances as fee income is stretched ever thinner. But enough of the doom and gloom. There are still routes by which scholars can pursue study within arts and humanities, as we are about to hear from someone who has done so themselves. And that someone is Alice Taylor, a Professor of Medieval History and Vice Dean for Research in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at King's College London. Alice is an award-winning author whose academic career has been distinguished by many collaborations across institutions and disciplines. She has demonstrated marked success in securing funding for her work, so I was keen to extract as much advice as possible on what makes for successful grant applications. But more recently, she led the launch of a new doctoral school for arts and humanities at King's, which opens this year. So I was also very keen to find out more about the thinking behind this bold move when so many are bemoaning the erosion of these disciplines. Now, I should say this rich conversation is set within the context of UK higher education, and it should be acknowledged that the research funding situation in every country varies. But the increasingly challenging funding environment is mirrored across a lot of nations right now, and there are lots of transferable lessons here for early career researchers anywhere. So, let's hear from Alice. Alice Taylor is a Professor of Medieval History at King's College London, and her first book, The Shape of the State in Medieval Scotland, was co-awarded the Royal Historical Society's Whitfield Prize in 2017. The same year, she was awarded the prestigious Philip Leverhulme Prize for History. She has since produced 2 more books and is working on 2 more at the moment, and leading a collaborative project looking at ways to present Scottish medieval texts in new digital formats. And that really is just the tip of the iceberg. So Alice, great to speak to you today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, you are someone who is making an unquestionable success of being a career historian, something that many would say is a tricky thing to do. So could you give a quick narrative summary of your career to date and what's led you to your current role at King's?
Sure, of course. So I joined King's as a lecturer in medieval British history in 2011. And before that, I'd come from a research fellowship in Cambridge. And then before that, I did my doctorate and all my undergraduate stuff in Oxford. And so in that way, I'd kind of had quite a traditional route into academia. And I started at King's about 3 years after defederalisation of the University of London. So one of the things that we were doing was really getting to grips, like as a university, as being a degree awarding institution. So previously everybody would get their degrees from the University of London, but also it corresponded with with the introduction of fees as well. So it was quite a tumultuous time anyway there. Little did we know what would come out. And I had a very traditional academic career for the first few years, apart from the fact that I was also involved in some collaborative research projects, which quite a lot of historians do, but it's by no means the norm, I suppose you could say. So I'd had the opportunity to be involved on the peripheries of a quite big digital project, what was then called the Paradox of Medieval Scotland. It's evolved into the People of Medieval Scotland, which was co-produced by historians at King's and at the University of Glasgow, but also crucially, the then Department of Digital Humanities, which still very much exists, but that part of it has evolved into something called King's Digital Lab. And so that gave me a quite early experience into these collaborative projects that then continued with a project called Models of Authority, which was again a collaboration between Glasgow, King's College London, and the University of Cambridge. And so alongside a kind of more traditional, like historical academic career where you're doing your teaching, you're developing your teaching portfolios, and you're also publishing and you're trying to write books, I'd also had this experience in being involved in collaborative work and what the kind of practicalities of that meant and also what the possibilities of that might mean, both in terms of intellectual possibilities and in terms of what you could do with that level of resourcing and crucially collaboration behind you that you couldn't really do on an individual perspective. So that gave me an interest as a medieval historian in the funding environment that I continued with the follow-on project, which started in 2017, which was the Community of the Realm of Scotland, which was funded by the AHRC. And also I've received other bits of funding for my work from the British Academy and the, as you mentioned before, the Leverhulme Trust, which again has provided a level of capacity injection into my work that I otherwise wouldn't have had. And so that was the kind of broader context in which I thought, well, I've benefited from gaining external funding. And so after I'd got my professorship in 2020, I decided to take what looked like a bit of a sideways step into actually research leadership, what's now called academic leadership. And so from 2023, I've been the Vice Dean for Research in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. And that's a role that has brought me much more into contact with the strategy behind research funding, why it's important, and also the challenges it brings, which are both kind of systemic and also very particular to the current moment, as well as also how to ensure that we can not just protect the things that we want to protect, but also develop and grow and sustain them, in an environment which, for all sorts of reasons, is changing very rapidly.
I'm glad that you pointed to a number of notable sources of funding that have allowed you to pursue the work that you wish to pursue. So you mentioned the Arts and Humanities Research Council, British Academy, obviously the Leverhulme Trust that we mentioned earlier. Yeah, as a historian, clearly one of the things that has facilitated your career progressing as it has is that you have been incredibly successful in securing funding. So why do you think this is? Because many are not.
That's a difficult question to answer. I think, first of all, coming from where I do, which is obviously the arts and humanities, but also a medieval historian, often the research culture that we have is very individualistic. And that's not true across arts and humanities, but it is probably true to say that the research culture is more individualistic, where you go, you do your research, you write a book, and the default is single author publications rather than joint author publications or collaborative writing, although it is interesting that this is beginning to change. So the idea of collaboration is not something that's necessarily inherent in your earliest training. So as a doctoral student in the early 2000s, as I was, the number of people doing collaborative doctoral awards were much, much smaller. And obviously it's an individual project in a way that still even now, people who come from the hard sciences find quite difficult to understand. Like, how can this, a PhD project, be an individual independent research project? So I think there's kind of that the culture traditionally, although this is changing and changing quite rapidly, was quite individualistic. But also a lot of it is to do with the kind of work that you do. So again, in that transition point in the early 2000s, where there was a real skill difference between if you wanted to do something in the kind of nascent digital space, but your training, say, was as a medieval historian and that you'd spent the last few years of your life trying to get your Latin better and your paleography and your codicology, that didn't necessarily come with a whole host of digital skills. Now I think those boundaries are much more beginning to break down. So if you're looking at younger generations, you're looking at people who have incredible digital skills, digital capabilities, at the same time as also developing those traditional skills. So no, it's first of all, I think it's a research culture thing, but also second of all, the funding structure was very, very different as well. So that in some way, the requirement to gain external funding quite early on in your career was less apparent, and particularly less apparent in rich institutions. So that idea of how research is paid for, how do we actually fund research, it is much more present in the minds of arts and humanities researchers than I think it was 15 years ago. In terms of success, I think the main thing is that often funding councils and funding bodies are very specific about how they're asking you to talk about your research. And the idea that you are asking your peers, because obviously these are applications that are assessed by a peer review college, whether that's the peer review college of the AHRC or any other UKRI body, or within charitable research foundations such as the British Academy or the Leverhulme Trust. These are your peers who are assessing your application. That you have to frame what you're writing in a way that makes it very clear as to what your research is going to do, why it is a good investment for vast amounts of money to be poured into it, and why you're the best person to do that. And I think that's not, again, something that we're necessarily taught to do early enough. But now, again, over the past 10 years, as more and more institutions have realized the importance of doing this, that advice and that level of support that you get when writing these applications has transformed as the pressures have increased.
So getting funding has got harder, but there is also much more training and support out there. So perhaps there is some small balance to those things. Just pivoting from this individual perspective of an academic seeking funding to the kind of broader funding strategy and the systemic challenges that you referenced earlier, there is a lot of concerns expressed in writing and verbally about the changes to UKRI and the cuts to the Arts and Humanities Research Council's funding powers. How damaging do you think these changes are potentially going to be to disciplines sitting within arts and humanities? And are there other routes researchers can take to support their work that might go some way to bridging the gap?
There's a lot in your question. So first, in relation to the systemic point, I don't think it would be unfair or a surprise to say that we're all very much aware that the higher education funding model is not in a great place at the moment. And obviously one of the reasons for that has been extremely well documented, is the increasing reliance since the introduction of fees, but also since inflation and rising costs, has been the reliance on fee income as the main source of income for all universities. And therefore what happens when that fee income either becomes unstable, or the competition means that smaller players are pushed out of the market. And again, this is not a new thing to say, but obviously that has knock-on effects to research, because research has always run at a loss for universities, because it's not in and of itself income generating. And the difficulty is obviously if we're thinking about it from a STEM perspective, there are real and substantial costs to doing world-leading research, from technicians to labs to equipment, that are often seen in contrast to, say, the arts and humanities, which, I've got colleagues who use supercomputers in their work, but most of us don't. That's not to say that our research doesn't come with costs, but it doesn't often come with the same level of massive infrastructure costs. But because of the instability in income in general, essentially what's happened to the way in which our research is funded is that because it's what's called own funded research, so it's research that the institution in general funds, so most research in arts and humanities and indeed in social sciences is still paid for in some sense by the institution itself, and there's only a proportion of that which is paid for by external sources, whether they be the Arts and Humanities Research Council or any other council run by the UKRI, or whether that be the European Research Council, for example, or any charitable kind of foundation or philanthropic donation. So that sense of our research moving from being understood as being cheap to being unfunded, so running at a cost to a university, has become much more prevalent since costs have just gone up in general. And so that idea as an academic that you spend some of your time on education, some of your time on research, and some of your time on administration has become a model which is quite difficult to sustain, while also the pressures of continuing to deliver as excellent and world-class in education as you can, while also delivering excellent and world-class research. Those two things maintain the same. So the pressures maintain the same, but the costs of delivering them have become higher and the income has become more unstable. So it's a tricky situation. So when we talk about there being more pressure on research council budgets, it's partly because more areas of the university are being asked to consider how their research is being funded. So that's the kind of systemic challenge. And obviously that puts more and more pressure on the budgets of research councils. And then there's the wider context, which obviously, although the UKRI itself has received, more money in real in cash terms over the last few years, obviously the costs and inflation means that actually it's a cut and there's more pressure on those budgets. And the HRC has not been immune to that. I mean, it is the smallest research council out of all the research councils. That partly reflects the costs of doing research, but it also partly reflects priorities more generally. But it still has a budget, roughly, if you look at the UKRI's plan of £70 million a year. But the other crucial part of that is a lot of that is already tied up, because research, as we know, is a long-term game. It takes a long time to do, or at least very good research takes a long time to do. So most research projects are funded, for 3 years. And so what that means, if you're a budget holder in this context, one can imagine that you're looking at that and you're always having to make really long-term projections while being dependent on government funding, and governments may change. So there's a difficulty there that the research councils themselves, I think, are under in terms of how to maintain commitments to projects that are already in existence, how to respond to a rapidly changing economic and financial environment, and how to then also kind of be agile in terms of the kinds of things that one is actually funding. So that's quite a long summary of, I think, some of the challenges that they're in. And then, one's just an individual researcher and you want to do your research project and you think this has to be done now because it's a pressing issue, and that the collaborations and the relationships I have can happen now. And you can begin to see how the wider systemic pressures, I think, can begin to act very negatively on the capacity of individuals to actually develop these projects and get them funded at the right time.
Yeah, absolutely. And you pointed to the fact that STEM, or healthcare-based research, for example, can generate huge costs of far greater magnitude than what is likely for research within the arts and humanities. But I can see there's also a problem that for arts and humanities, there's a less obvious commercial tie-up. So where funding might be sought away from research councils through commercial partnerships and the lure of future profit, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but that looks like something that would be a lot harder in arts and humanities disciplines.
I think it's new. So the innovation agenda, which is a very interesting one and has obviously been around in STEM for much longer, is one that is growing at the moment. And how that speaks to arts and humanities research, I think, is probably one of the most interesting spaces that we're going into. But it is also something that all research councils are investing in, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council is investing in. And what kind of innovation means? It can be social innovation as well. So it doesn't have to be commercial innovation. That's not the only way to think about what the word innovation means in a research space. But the idea that your research is tied to industry in some way, or relates to industry in the broadest possible way, I think is an idea that we will be seeing more and more, and that also universities are investing in, not just for financial reasons, I should say. I think for reasons that are also to do with what's happening to the knowledge economy and the role of the role that higher education plays in that space. Because again, I don't want to underestimate just how transformative the last 10 to 15 years have been in terms of how knowledge is accessed and how that has the potential to destabilize the role of the university in the pursuit of knowledge and the generation of knowledge. So that sense that as institutions, we need to connect ourselves quite explicitly, not necessarily to commercial agendas, but to partnership building in general. There is a kind of logic to that in the sense that if you go back 15 years, that would be 2010. If you wanted to read a journal article, you would have to go into a building that probably you would need prior permission to access. And now, obviously, with open access, there's the capacity to read these things in general. And so that sense that the knowledge that has been generated out of the academy is very much now out of the academy in all areas also means that we do have to think about how we are putting our work out there and for whom and for what in a way that could be generative as much as it is challenging.
Yes, yeah, it's an interesting point. It makes me think your summary of what an individual researcher needs to do when applying for a research grant, be really clear about what the research is doing, explain why it's relevant or useful and why you are the best person to do it. I feel like there's a job for universities to do that on a much grander institutional or even sector level in this new reality in which we exist, where certain functions of a traditional university are no longer so relevant, but equally there is huge import in terms of the educational research, discovery, engagement side of what they're doing. But you're right, perhaps that's going to require much greater partnership working.
It's really interesting because the argument for arts and humanities research is what is high level knowledge, really? That is in some way such a defining question of our current moment. How do we understand what cultural knowledge is, like how it's produced? These are things that, we can absolutely say. And we've got so many examples of the real world benefit and impact that this work has had through REF. And now those are stories I think that we can be proud of. And indeed are the argument for the social benefit. They evidence the social benefit that we already know exists in this space. But it does bring us back to the other kind of question, I suppose, which is, what's the training that we're giving to doctoral students, to early career students, to how to navigate this really quite different context.
And that benefit you reference, the point now, and this is where, as you say, the training will be needed, is it's not enough to do the work. You've got to demonstrate why it is indeed beneficial. This actually brings us on nicely to the new doctoral college, because we've referenced the changes to funding and much broader socio-economic, political, technological changes that the last 10 years has seen. But right now, we have a government who, given that they have extremely tight budgets to be working with, seem unwilling to support a huge amount in the academy that sits outside of their fairly obvious economic and political priorities. And arts and humanities funding, many would argue, is suffering as a result. We are seeing disciplines falling under arts and humanities being cut across UK institutions, and King's College has opened a new doctoral school in this area. So, I mean, you led this project, Alice. How on earth did you make this happen? where is the support coming from?
Well, first of all, there is a huge amount of institutional support from senior leadership at King's College. So, I mean, particularly this is something that our vice principal, Sir Bashir Al Hashimi, who's the vice principal for research and innovation, has championed from the beginning and been open to. And I know there's been a lot of coverage about the changes to the HRC's provision for doctoral funding. So, just to summarize, is that the number of funded studentships is going down from about 420 something to around 300 within a few years' time. But the main difference is that whereas the majority of those previously funded were what are called student-driven or curiosity-driven doctoral projects, as in the student suggests the topic, they apply to a doctoral training program, which are regionally based. and they either get the funding or they don't get the funding. The number of those student-driven and curiosity-driven ones will drop from this year to 150, with the only a proportion of universities will get 3 per year. So the numbers that's quite a significant difference in actuality. Although it should be said that the amount of money and the proportion of its budget that the AHRC puts into doctoral training is still proportionally the highest of all research councils. So it's quite a complex message, that one, but that shift from actually being a predominantly curiosity-driven doctoral program and student-driven doctoral program, the place of that is still there, but it's minimal. And the idea of 3 per year across the whole of arts and humanities is obviously quite worrying. And that's not to say that other things aren't coming in as well. So the doctoral focal awards are kind of particularly exciting, I think, in this space, because they really encourage collaboration between universities on particular areas, so specialists. It allows people to pool their resources in different ways. But we've known this was coming since October 2023. And our then executive dean, who's now in Edinburgh, Marion Thane, was very, very, very supportive of us working in this space. And we also had the director of our AHRC DTP, which was the London Arts and Humanities Partnership, who's a woman called Professor Jo Molt. The way the AHRC were communicating was through those DTPs. So we were very much aware of what was going on with the AHRC and had, not a lot of time, because nothing moves fast in big institutions. But we had enough time to be able to actually think, okay, well, what are we going to do? And we did take the concerns that had been raised in a report that the HRC had commissioned about doctoral training, but also things that were coming out of our own equality, equity, diversity and inclusion surveys of King's PhDs and the work that we wanted to do anyway, about, okay, what are we actually doing with doctoral training? So we did use it actually as an opportunity to think, okay, in this very, very different world that we all now live in, are we actually, preparing our students adequately? Well, adequately is like the wrong word, because of course we are, preparing our students, but are we preparing the students in a way that lessens the burden on individual work? And what I mean by that is that as academics, we're very used to having to do everything ourselves, sometimes to a fault. And actually, there are now increasing amounts of training, workshops, opportunities in universities that mean that burden is slightly lessened. And I suppose the question that we asked ourselves is, are we doing that enough in an interdisciplinary space for our PhD students, or is there a gap that we can usefully fill? And I think it was through that, it was both the challenges of the current moment. How are we going to ensure that we can repurpose the big investment that all universities put into the doctoral training partnership? So King's would put in studentships to the DTP as well as the HRC, so it works on a matched funding type model. So how can we repurpose that investment so that we are creating a institutional hub, essentially, of PhD training that brings not only these landscape awards together, but also internal King's studentships, but also provides a real launch pad for other kinds of bids as well. So we made a successful bid to the Leverhulme Trust for one of their doctoral scholarships programs, which is called Knowledge Orders Before Modernity. So we could be this kind of hub of PhD training in different ways, and also crucially provide our students with opportunities around what we think are really key skills that meet some of the challenges of the present moment. So the first one is obviously around, how do you create partnerships? Like, how do you work externally? Some students come in, they may be coming in having done a different kind of job, they're used to that. Some are coming in straight from a master's and haven't ever really been outside of a university setting. So how do you actually do that? How do you learn from each other? And trying to add a dynamic to PhD life, which is that it's less lonesome in a way, and that you can really learn from other people, but not just learn content from other people, learn about the way they work, how they make connections, even just how to email somebody. Like, how do you create a partner? So that's one. The other one is around impact, knowledge exchange, and public engagement. So we're very lucky in King's is that we have excellent provision for impact within the faculty led by a man called Dr. Ed Stevens. And how can we create sustainable training programs that also we can open source as well, so that they're not just kept within King's? And then the other part is on open research methods and digital skills. We are now in an environment where a lot of research is done digitally, but there are lots of issues with that, both about a skills gap. Do you actually know what you're doing and how you're using it? But also questions of sustainability. How do you ensure that any sort of digital product is sustainable beyond a kind of certain point? And also critical methods. So this is about how do we understand the kind of the intellectual inheritance that is often commonly shared across arts and humanities in relatively critical ways that help us kind of understand essentially why things take very culturally different shapes. So we're opening our doors this semester, so we'll be open for applications hopefully in November. And that we hope will be something that not just benefits King's students, but also will provide things that other institutions can use as well. It will be part of our provision to the new AHRC landscape that we're in. So we're in a hub with 12 other universities. And it's something that I really hope will, again, provide a springboard, not just as arguments as to why arts and humanities research matters, but why arts and humanities doctoral research matters. We tend to often conflate those two things, but also obviously lots of people do a PhD and don't end up in academia. So that question of what is that doctoral training allowing them to do in their subsequent professional life, and what are we preparing them for? It's not defensive. That is actually about, there is a value to this level of knowledge as opposed to a master's level knowledge that provides time, space that is beneficial to other institutions and other parts of our social and economic life and cultural life. So that's the hope.
It's really nice and quite refreshing to hear about a new project and all the potential positive outcomes and admirable ambitions for what it could do at a time when, it has to be said, a lot of the narrative across UK higher education is a narrative of decline. And one of the things that strikes me from what you described there of what this new doctoral school is hoping to do is equip a lot of these doctoral students with a huge number of really transferable skills. So your point that they may well then transfer out of academia, well, they'll be leaving armed with hopefully a really great toolkit of skills and capabilities and knowledge that will stand them in really good stead, and as you say, then feed into wider socio-economic benefits. You have mentioned the AHRC changes and the fact that King's will have 3 studentships funded, as each institution included in this roster will. You've also got funded PhD via the Leverhulme Trust. But I just wonder, given that the AHRC doctoral funding has reduced to 3 individuals, where is the rest of the money going to come from for the other doctoral candidates involved in this? I mean, you mentioned the Doctoral Focal Awards. Can you talk us through where some of the other funding streams are?
It is a really, really tricky one. So, the bigger question that all institutions have is how much internal support is it going to, is it going to give to these programs? Because that is a key, that is the baseline component of any broader long-term doctoral strategy, which is that what are you going to do within your own institution and for whom and in what context? And one of the things that is extremely, I think, powerful, and again, this goes well beyond our faculty about what King's has done, is that it has basically said, we think arts and humanities are absolutely key to understanding the digital revolution, the new age that we're kind of currently living in, because these ideas coming from philosophy, religion, religious studies, literature, history, all of this is also being transformed. So I think there's some, and that we need these things as well. And so that's why it's been doing quite a lot of really interesting things. So it's had this kind of flagship AI Plus program. I mean, AI is obviously everywhere. But one of the really interesting things that King's has done is that AI plus. It's not just AI, it's AI plus another subject. So it's really thinking about it in a kind of holistic way. A lot of the interest in that scheme has been across the board and within the arts and humanities. So I think there has to be a bit of institutional willingness to resist that narrative, but also crucially for people who are working in this space to really make that narrative themselves and on the terms that the university needs to hear, because fundamentally, we do have to balance our books in some way. So there has to be like a willingness on both sides to actually say, this is why we matter. And again, we have the evidence base. We have the evidence base from 2021. We have the evidence base even from the work now that's being done around the engagement and impact, whatever that means. All of this relatively what looks like small scale work, but we've never been able to document it before. But now we can in a different sort of way. So I think there's that point which has to be, what is the institutional conversation? The second one, I think, is who are you working with? Where are your partners? And how can we all work together? And that's where, to ensure that actually we're not duplicating. And by that, I don't mean cost-saving efficiencies, but I mean that we can't be all things to all men, and that there are things that you can do as a big generalist, multidisciplinary institution that you can't do if you're a small specialist institution. But equally, there are things that you can do as a small specialist institution that you can't do if you're a big generalist institution. So I think that sense of there is a different sort. I know that the focus on education has been for such a long time about market competition, but that in a research space is the end, basically. And you can begin to see this, like you can see it in the UKRI New Priorities, is this real focus on collaboration. So it's not that we're singing from different hymn sheets. And then the third one is this sense of, as an individual academic, this is something that we all have a responsibility for. The doctoral focal awards, I mean, we were lucky enough that to receive a PI-ship of one of them, and that was a project that is led by Professor Sarah Atkinson from the Department of Culture, Media and Creative Industries, with partners from London South Bank and from Guildhall, and those relationships have been developed over years. And it's a form of work, again, that goes away from the individual and what oneself is doing and producing, and more towards, okay, what am I cultivating for the future? And so I would also say that there are opportunities. There are not that many. So there's the doctoral network awards. There are opportunities for PhD students within ERC projects. There's obviously different sorts of philanthropic opportunities. And obviously there's the Leverhulme Doctoral Scholarships Programme that all institutions can only put one in. They can only put one application in. But the main thing is, I think, is to think about what is the main challenge affecting my field at the moment, or fields that are related to mine, and why does it matter, and why is doctoral training the answer? And that's something that I think the Leverhulme Doctoral Scholarships Programme is really astonishing at requiring you to answer. It's not simply at what's called a CDT, a Centre for Doctoral Training, where it's like we're doing this subject. It's really asking you to think about, why is doctoral training the answer to this problem? And that is about intergenerational shifts. Fundamentally, it's about thinking about what does the next generation need to have in order to ensure that this level of knowledge, again, a level of knowledge that is different from what you get at an undergraduate degree, it's different from what you get at an MA degree, but this level of knowledge is key to sustaining our understanding of this broad area. And in the case of knowledge orders before modernity, this is something obviously that's very dear to my heart. This is PI'd by Professor Julia Crick, who's Professor of Paleography and Manuscript Studies at King's. And this is something that you would think I'm going to sound incredibly Pollyanna-ish here, for which I apologise, but you would think, there's no way this is going to get funded because it's about, it's about medieval manuscripts. But the point that was made is that these are skills that we don't teach, anymore, because the market model doesn't work, because, you're generally dealing with quite small numbers of people, and it's incredibly specialist, and it requires resources, and it requires time, and it's difficult. But this is something that was like, we're also at this point where medieval manuscripts have never been more accessible. The libraries and archives have done this extraordinary project where you can be sitting in your study and you've got the entire, well, not the entire, but almost the entire Library of the Vatican at your disposal on your screen through the IIIF framework. So we're at this paradox in a way that we're disinvesting in the capability to read and interpret these massive parts of global heritage at the same time as they're becoming more and more accessible and more meaningful. So how do we actually begin to navigate that gap? And that was the point that this program made. And it's multidisciplinary. It's not just history, it's philosophy, it's literature, it's languages, but it's something there that is about that sense of why does that intergenerational training matter, and how can we do it differently? So I wouldn't want to say that I think it's all going great, but at this moment where there are major challenges, I think we have a responsibility to our disciplines, many of which have been around for hundreds of years, to think about how we can best meet them and ensure that there will not be as many opportunities as there were in the heyday of the mid-2000s, for example, but there are as many opportunities as we can possibly make.
Yeah, and your point about the focus on partnership and collaboration, that is something, and those are words that I hear brought up repeatedly by those across higher education. There is undoubtedly an increasing focus on doing things collaboratively with other institutions, other researchers, both within the UK, globally, and perhaps amidst a huge number of different things that are challenging the sector in many ways. Perhaps that is one very positive outcome that people are being forced to work together in new and more ways. Focusing in on the individual doctoral researchers, because the opportunities do still exist, but there are less of them. Ergo, it's more competitive than it was before. It can feel, depending on what you're reading, like the odds are increasingly stacked against, well, early career researchers more broadly, but certainly doctoral researchers. So what would your advice be to a doctoral researcher today in terms of securing the funding they need for their work? Can you break it down into some practical tips?
I'll try, because there are fewer funded PhD places around. I think the first one is the simplest, which is when funders are asking for how would you define the originality, the significance, the rigor of your proposal, they're doing that as a way of trying to sift. They've got far too many applications. So how do we best ensure that we are funding the best bet proposals? And so what that boils down to basically is really work on your application. And by that, I don't just mean, read around the topic, but really think about what might this mean? Why do I want to do it? And for whom? Why do I want to do it? Why do I think this is important as opposed to something else? Why this topic? And I think that we all have to, and I include myself here, we all have to work harder to do that because the space is more crowded now. The second thing is, in the context of fewer resources, the odds are not great. But that being said, the more that you are able to develop a relationship with potential supervisors, to develop that project over a slightly longer time, again, I think that sense of when people are coming in to do their doctorate is really important. That you take the time to develop a project that you really feel confident in. And if your supervisor is saying, or your potential supervisor is saying, look, I actually think I'm not the best person, listen to that, take it somewhere else. Or I think it needs more work here. Again, listen to that and take it somewhere else. And do as much work as you think possible in terms of who's the best fit, who's the best supervisor for you. And it's not always the big name. That often, particularly when you're in this, often people will be like, well, I need to have a big name associated kind of with my work. But actually what's more important is like, what is the fit? Why is this person the best person to supervise your work? So it's both about you, where you are, how much you've kind of developed it. And also it's ensuring that what you're applying for gives you the best possible chance of success, and being very clear about why you want to do it. and for what? And there are many, many things that happen in the 3-4 years that one does a doctorate, and they may all take you into a place of wanting a career in academia, but equally they may take you into lots of different places. So what's the potential in your work? Who do you want to be working with, and what do you want to do at the end of it? And I wish I had easier answers, but I think that the clearer that we are with potential students about that, the better. That it has to be something that you know what you want to do with it.
Yeah, I don't think one can sugarcoat it, can you? It is difficult, but as you say, there are ways to facilitate success. As my younger sister once said to me about a very competitive job role that I was going for, and she said, "Well, man, someone's got to get it.
Someone's got to get it." Exactly.
Sometimes
Yeah.
That's the best attitude. I think that's a really great note to end on. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today, Alice.
Well, it's been
So there it is. Be clear on your purpose, why a PhD is necessary for your chosen area of interest, and what you want to get out of it, what the aim is. And then give long thought as to why you're the best person to carry out this research and how you're going to persuade others of this. Now, to anyone preparing a PhD grant application, I wish you all the best. And as Alice says, there is support out there, so find it and use it. If you'd like more insight and advice on finding and securing research funding, do head to campus, where our latest Spotlight Guide brings together lots of resources on this subject, and you'll find all that at www.timeshighereducation.com/campus. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and subscribe, and we'll be back with you in a couple of weeks. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.